The entire alibi of the McCanns and their friends that night rests on a single pillar, the claim that they checked on the children every 30 minutes. But the testimony of one friend, Matthew Oldfield, regarding the crucial 9:30 p.m. check contains a contradiction so devastating that once exposed, it doesn't just suggest the check was a sham, it invalidates the entire abduction timeline. The Portuguese investigator Gonçalo Amaral recognized this from the very beginning. And today, we will explore the evidence that he was right. The deepest flaw isn't hidden in complex details, it's in the simple truth of a check that never actually happened. The story we were told is almost a fairy tale in reverse. It begins in a paradise, Praia da Luz in Portugal, a holiday resort where danger feels like a distant fiction. At the heart of the story are the perfect characters, Kate and Jerry McCann, two successful British doctors, the very picture of an ideal couple. And of course, the princess of the tale, Madeleine, a 3-year-old girl with unmistakable eyes, a face that would become one of the most recognized on the planet. The official narrative is simple, almost rehearsed. On the night of May 3, 2007, the doctor parents are dining with friends at a tapas restaurant just 50 meters from the apartment where their 3 young children are sleeping. They feel safe, having created a rotation system to check on the children, a decision the entire world would later judge with the ferocity of a tribunal. At 10 p.m., the fairy tale shatters. Kate McCann goes to check on her children and finds Madeleine's bed empty, the bedroom window open. Panic ignites a frantic search, first with friends, then resort staff, then the police. Paradise transforms into a crime scene as the world watches, horrified. Millions are donated, and celebrities like David Beckham and J.K. Rowling appeal for help. Madeleine's face is everywhere. The story is clear. An innocent child was taken from her bed by a monster who came through the window, and a perfect family was destroyed by an unforeseeable tragedy. That's the polished version they sold us, packaged for the media. The story that needed to be true for the world to continue making sense. That's the story that spread across the globe. And speaking of the globe, I'm curious, what time is it where you're watching? Leave a comment below. It's always fascinating to see how our community of investigators is spread across every corner of the planet, united in the search for truth. Now, let's get back to the case, because it's right there, in the story everyone accepted, that the biggest lie of all is hiding. What if the pillar supporting this entire story is rotten? What if the checking routine, the group's great alibi, is not just flawed but a deliberate fiction created to hide a fatal gap in time? The thesis of this video is a surgical strike at the heart of the McCanns' alibi. We will explore, using the group's own statements, how the 9:30 p.m. check never happened as described. And by demonstrating this, we will show that the window of opportunity for a tragic event becomes so large and the group's actions so illogical that the abduction theory becomes unsustainable. This video will show that Gonçalo Amaral's initial suspicion was not a hunch, but a logical deduction based on the most obvious inconsistency in the entire case. To do this, we don't need specialized canines or complex DNA analysis. We just need a clock and the contradictory statements of a group of friends who, on that night, failed in their most important task. To show the checking routine was a farce, we first need to understand just how fragile the story it was meant to protect really was. The official abduction narrative, when placed under the cold light of logic, begins to disintegrate. The crime scene itself is the first witness, and it tells a very different story. They said an abductor entered through the bedroom window, but the evidence suggests a physical impossibility. According to forensics, the window had no signs of forced entry. The external shutters were lifted, and the glass window was opened from the inside. The Portuguese police tried to recreate this entry and failed. For the story to work, we have to believe in an abductor who is an Olympic-level acrobat, capable of contorting through a tiny gap to reach the latch, all without leaving a single fingerprint, a strand of hair, or a fiber of clothing, a forensic ghost. They said the abductor took the child and left. But which way? The front door was locked. The story then adjusts. He left through the back patio door. which was conveniently unlocked. But this door opened onto an area visible from the restaurant where the group was dining. The official story asks us to believe in a criminal who is simultaneously an invisible acrobat and an amateur who chooses the riskiest possible escape route. The crime scene doesn't scream abduction. It whispers staged. If the scene is a stage, the statements are the script. And the script of the Tapas 7, the McCanns group of friends, is full of contradictory lines and unconvincing performances. This is where the alibi of the Czechs begins to crumble. Let's enter the theater of the Czechs. The official story is that they took turns every 30 minutes. Jerry McCann says he did a check at 9:05 p.m. and all was well. The next one was supposed to be at 9:30 p.m. and it was Matthew Oldfield's responsibility. This is where the entire story falls apart. In his statement, Matthew admits that he went to the McCann's apartment, but he did not enter the children's room. He stopped at the doorway, saw the bedroom door was ajar, heard silence, and assumed everything was fine. He did not visually confirm if Madeleine was in her bed. This is not a check. It's a sham of a check. He failed to perform the one task assigned to him. The consequence of this is devastating for the official timeline. If Jerry's 9:05 p.m. check was the last time anyone saw Madeleine, and the next time someone entered the room was at 10 p.m. with Kate, this creates a 55-minute gap, almost an hour. The abduction story depends on a lucky and precise criminal who got in and out in less than 30 minutes. But if the window of time is almost an hour, the story changes completely. The intruder no longer needs to be a timed ninja. He has all the time in the world. This makes the lack of witnesses, the lack of DNA, the lack of any trace of a stranger even more inexplicable. Matthew Oldfield's non-check is not a small mistake. It's the black hole that swallows the entire credibility of the abduction theory. Their story simply doesn't add up. What strikes you as the more significant flaw in the official story? The physical impossibility of the window entry, or the timeline shattered by the check that never was? Leave your investigator's opinion in the comments below. The theories from this community often see what others ignore. Although our thesis focuses on the logical failure of the alibi, science also enters the scene to confirm the suspicions this failure raises. When human logic fails, scientific evidence becomes the final judge. The specialized canines, Eddie and Keela, brought an inconvenient truth. Inside apartment 5 amperes, weeks after the disappearance, Eddie, the dog trained to detect the scent of the deceased, gave a positive alert in several locations. Behind the sofa and in the parents' bedroom, Keela, the biological evidence detection dog, also alerted to traces on the floor. Science was indicating that a tragic event involving human remains and biological evidence had occurred in that apartment. But the most devastating discovery, and the one that connects directly to our thesis, came from the car the McCanns rented 25 days after the disappearance. Inside the trunk of that Renault Scenic, Eddie alerted again, unequivocally, to the scent of human remains. Subsequent analysis confirmed the presence of DNA compatible with Madeleine McCann's in the trunk. How does this connect to the failure of the checks? Directly. If the abduction story is impossible because of the broken timeline, it means the most likely explanation for Madeleine's disappearance is a tragic death inside the apartment. And if a death occurred in the apartment, the remains needed to be moved. The scientific evidence in the car confirms exactly that. Human remains were transported. The failure in the alibi of the checks is the cause. The scientific evidence in the car is the effect. One doesn't make sense without the other. The lie about the checks wasn't to cover up simple negligence. It was to cover up the fact that they needed time. Time to think, time to plan, time to hide the evidence of a tragedy. Science was screaming that human remains had been there and had been moved, and the logical analysis of the statement screams that the alibi meant to prevent this was a fraud. If the abduction story is a sham, what really happened in that 55-minute gap? To answer that, we need to do what Gonzalo Amaral tried to do. Reconstruct the night of the crime based on the absence of care, not on the fiction of an abductor. Forget the story of the phantom intruder. Forget the open window. The key to understanding that night is not in what happened, but in what didn't happen. A check. The absence of care. Let's reconstruct the night based on this absence. The night probably unfolded like this. The children are left alone. The group of friends is dining, drinking, relaxing. Responsibility is diffuse, shared, and therefore neglected. At 9:05 p.m., Jerry McCann does a check. He returns to the table. From this point on, the children's safety becomes a mirage. The next check at 9:30 p.m. by Matthew Oldfield is a sham. He doesn't go in, doesn't see, doesn't confirm. He just performs an empty ritual. It is in the gap between 9:05 p.m. and 10 p.m. that the tragedy occurs. The exact cause becomes secondary to the certainty of negligence. It could have been a fall. It could have been a reaction to a sedative. It could have been any household accident that happens in seconds when small children are left unsupervised. What matters is what happens at 10 p.m. Kate McCann goes to the apartment. She doesn't find an abductor. She finds her daughter unresponsive. The panic is real, but it's not the panic of an abduction. It's the panic of a mother who comes face to face with the final, irreversible consequence of her own negligence. In that moment, the world splits into two realities. In the first, she screams for help, admits the negligence, calls for assistance, and faces the investigation, the public judgment, the guilt. In the second, darker reality, the story can be rewritten. The instinct for self-preservation, the fear of social and professional ruin, speaks louder. The tragedy needs a villain, and that villain cannot be them. The abduction narrative is born there, not as a genius plan, but as a desperate lie whispered in the chaos. So a window is opened, a story is born, and an alibi of regular checks is hastily constructed to place a veneer of responsibility over a night of profound neglect. This begs the question, what could compel a group of 9 adults, most of them parents, to either participate in or stay silent about such a monumental fabrication? Psychology offers a few key concepts. First, there's the diffusion of responsibility. In a group, the obligation to act is diluted. Someone should have checked better becomes no single person was solely responsible. Second, there's group pressure and a toxic form of loyalty. In a crisis, allegiance to a friend can override a commitment to the truth, especially if that truth means the complete destruction of that friend's life. The story about the checks isn't just to protect the McCanns, it's to protect the entire group from the charge of collective negligence. They aren't accomplices to a malicious act, but to a concealment born from shared guilt. They didn't need to be monsters, they just needed to be human, weak, and terrified of the consequences of their own mistakes. The lie about the checks was the shield that protected them all from the most painful truth. They had failed, collectively, in their most basic duty. At this point, which narrative seems to hold more weight? The one built on the psychology of fear and self-preservation, or the story of a phantom intruder? Let me know in the comments if the pieces are starting to fit together for you, because the evidence I'm about to show you isn't just a theory. The definitive proof, the smoking gun that suggests Gonzalo Amaral was on the right path from the start, isn't found in a lab or under a microscope. It's found in their own alibi when it's held up against the simple logic of a real-world crime. It's a proof by contradiction, a puzzle we can call the paradox of the all-knowing abductor. The official story asks us to believe in an intruder who possessed almost godlike knowledge. First, this person knew the children were alone. Second, they knew exactly which apartment they were in. Third, they knew the back door was unlocked. And fourth, and most importantly, they knew about the 30-minute checking routine, timing their actions perfectly to get in and out within this tight interval to avoid being caught. But this is where the lie about the checks destroys the abduction theory itself. If the 9:30 p.m. check didn't happen, the window of time wasn't 30 minutes, it was 55 minutes. No criminal, no matter how skilled, could have known that this specific check would fail. They would have had to operate under the assumption that they only had 30 minutes. So, we're left with two options, and both are absurd. Option 1. The abductor was a psychic who somehow guessed that Matthew Oldfield would perform a fake check, allowing them to act calmly for almost an hour, while still risking being caught at any moment. Option 2. The abductor was not a psychic and acted within the 30-minute window, but by a cosmic coincidence, they chose the exact night when the checking routine failed. And even though they had all the time in the world, they left not a single trace, not a single hair, not a single credible eyewitness. Occam's razor teaches us that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. And the simplest explanation isn't a psychic or cosmically lucky intruder. The simplest explanation is that there was no intruder. The story of the checking routine was invented after the fact to make it seem like they were careful parents and that the event could only have happened in a very short time frame. But they got tangled in their own lie. The failure of the 9:30 p.m. check, admitted by them, is the Freudian slip that reveals the entire farce. It creates a timeline that makes the abduction story they told logistically impossible. AMARAL needed nothing more. Their own story self-destructed. With this proof on the table, the question changes. It's no longer what happened to Madeleine, but who helped hide the truth. The answer may involve a conspiracy much larger than just a panicked couple. It involves the power of an entire state. Truth has incredible power, but it is not invincible. It can be silenced. And in the case of Madeleine McCann, the truth wasn't just silenced. It was actively crushed by a system that decided the reputation of a country and the image of an influential British couple were more important than justice for a child who had passed away. When the Portuguese police, led by Gonçalo Amaral, put the pieces together, the failed alibi, the stage scene, the specialized canine findings, the DNA in the car, they did what any police force would do. They declared Kate and Jerry McCann as arguidos, the Portuguese term for formal suspects. The investigation was on the right track. The truth was about to explode. And that's when the pushback began. The reaction from the British government was immediate and overwhelming. The then Prime Minister Gordon Brown and his ambassador to Portugal became directly involved, not to help find a missing child, but to defend the McCanns. The diplomatic pressure on Portugal was immense. The British media, instead of investigating, launched a brutal campaign to discredit the Portuguese police, painting them as incompetent and xenophobic. In response to Amaral's logical suspicions, a campaign was launched to disqualify him. In response to the canine alerts, a war of experts began, with specialists questioning a science used in courts around the world. And when the McCanns were named as formal suspects, the system's response was to remove Gonçalo Amaral from the case entirely. The man who dared to follow the trail of truth was silenced. The system didn't want the truth. The truth was ugly and inconvenient. It would tarnish Portugal's image as a safe tourist destination and create a diplomatic incident. It was easier, cleaner, to embrace the fiction of the mysterious abductor. The investigation was closed. The McCanns were cleared for lack of evidence and returned to England as tragic heroes, victims of an incompetent foreign police force. The lie won, but that victory came at a devastating human cost. The price of truth was paid by those who refused to stay silent. Gonçalo Amaral had his career destroyed. He wrote a book, Maddie, The Truth of the Lie, detailing the evidence he found. In response, the McCanns sued him, dragging him through a legal battle that lasted nearly a decade, trying to silence and bankrupt him. He became the scapegoat, the villain of the story, punished for doing his job. Other witnesses who contradicted the McCanns' version were intimidated or ignored. Locals who suspected the couple were labeled as cruel gossips. The truth became radioactive. To touch it meant risking your reputation, your career, your peace. The system sent a clear message: stay silent, let the story die. It's infuriating, it's frustrating, and that's why this channel exists. If you believe these stories of cover-ups need to be told, that the truth cannot be buried by power and money, then be part of this mission. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every subscription is a vote of confidence and a sign that we are not alone in this search. In the end, the moral verdict is clear. Despite a body of evidence that points overwhelmingly to a tragic accident followed by a cover-up, the Madeleine McCann case remains officially unsolved. Justice was never served, not for a lack of clues, but for a lack of will. The system chose to protect the powerful instead of defending the innocent. The narrative of a German suspect, Christian Bruckner, which emerged years later, seems more like a desperate attempt to give the public a new villain, a convenient closure that doesn't disturb the status quo and keeps the McCanns in the role of victims. But this theory, like the original one, is fragile and lacks concrete evidence directly linking him to Madeleine's disappearance. It's another smokescreen. The system won. Justice, it seems, was buried along with the truth of what happened to Madeleine. But in the midst of all this darkness, one final question remains, the most personal of all. What does this terrible story teach us about our own world? And what do we do with this inconvenient truth? It teaches us that justice is not blind. It can have a price. And sometimes the truth is just a negotiable commodity. This journey is clear and painful. Madeleine McCann was not the victim of a monster who crept through the night. She was the victim of a series of tragic decisions, beginning with negligence and ending with arrogance. What haunts me is not the mystery of what happened to her, but the clarity of what happened afterward. A conspiracy of silence orchestrated by fear and ego, and validated by a system that preferred a comfortable lie. The greatest tragedy of this case is not the initial event, but the cover-up. And now, after we've gone through all of this together, I need to know what this story has awakened in you. Use the comments below not to debate, but to bear witness. Bear witness to your outrage. Leave a word, a sentence that shows we have not forgotten, and we do not accept the silence. I will read every comment, because in a world that wants us to be quiet, our collective voice is the only weapon we have. And this fight against silence doesn't end here. The same dynamics of power, influence, and secrets we saw in Portugal are repeated in an infamous case in the United States. In our next documentary, we will investigate how the wealth and influence of the Ramsey family may have buried the truth along with their 6-year-old daughter, JonBenet. To continue on this mission with me, subscribe and turn on notifications. The search for truth cannot stop. Until next time, remember, the truth doesn't need you to believe in it. It only needs you not to forget.